And we're going to talk history now. We're going to talk A People's History of London, which is the fascinating book in front of me, written by the two people in front of me. They're Lindsey and John Rees. And they've written a history of London from the point of view of London as a city of rebellion, London as a city of revolt, of resistance, and all of those kind of things. I think we often get histories of London which concentrate, for understandable reasons, on the high politics of England, or on the church, or on the state, or on the crown, or on the city, and all of those kind of things. But this is a very different London. This is a London from below, if you like. And the people who've written it are here with me now. Lindsey and John, welcome to BBC London.
Thank you.
Why did you want to write this? Was it to sort of counterbalance, if you like?
Yeah, I think exactly as you say. You know, there are many books out there. I mean, piling up in the bookshops about the English monarchy and its place in London and the buildings and all the rest of it. And we wanted to say something else. We wanted to have partly a social history about how ordinary people lived, but also more than that, about how they've resisted and organised and tried to change the society. And London has a almost uniquely long and consistent history in this respect, and we wanted to kind of retell that story, really.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I remember I did history at school and I did history at university, and it was always, we were told Paris was the city of revolutions, and it was Paris that had the mob, and it was Paris that had and London was seen as this rather kind of quiescent place. But actually, when you look into it, that's not true.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look Paris, you have to give Paris credit for probably more revolutions than anywhere else in the world. But if you look at London, the 18th century, for example, when the French were making their revolution, there were also riots going on a lot of the time in London. It was probably the riot capital of the world in the 18th century. And right through then, you've had strikes, you've had demonstrations, you've had all those things where the poorest people have tried to stand up for their rights, and that's what we really wanted to talk about.
The London mob, which is this kind of almost this golem, isn't it? This thing that rises, and we've seen it, in very recent history. Is that a political entity, the London mob, or is it, as it's often portrayed, just a kind of an anarchic outpouring, if you like?
Oh no, I definitely think that it's a political thing. I mean, certainly in the period of a very long period of history where there were no trade unions, no mass political parties, no democracy of any kind, it was practically the only form of mass expression of discontent, a way of altering things, and that's a very, very long history from at least from before the Peasants' Revolt right the way through to the modern day. Of course, this side of the Industrial Revolution, when you have trade unions, when you have stable political parties, when you have mass campaigning organisations, when relatively recently, not until 1928. Universal suffrage in this country, but then the riot is as well as, or in relationship to these other things. But for very long periods of time, it was practically the form of political expression for people who were outside the political elite.
The London mob, I mean, where do you place something like the English Civil War in all of this? Because I've never quite been able to work out whether London is a radical city or it's a conservative city, if you see what I mean. It's kind of...
Well, in the English Revolution, it was definitely a radical city. It was never uncontested. There were always people who wanted peace with the king. There were always moderates who wanted a settlement. But overwhelmingly, it was driven by radicalism. And the Royalists recognised this. Edward Hyde, who was Charles I's key advisor, later Earl of Clarendon, said that London was the head and fountain of the revolution. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes thought that the revolution would never have taken place had the City of London not funded Parliament. So it was definitely, and of course Charles was actually driven out by the mob very early in the Civil War, and never made it back again until he was being executed in the banqueting house at Whitehall.
Well, in fact, the young people, the apprentices and the women were instrumental in this, and they went out to West London to stop him coming back in, and they closed the gates of the city on him. But there was a battle at Turnham Green, which is now out near Chiswick on the District line, which was then not in London, but where they actually fought to stop the king coming back. And this was the young apprentices went out and fought. I mean, it was a tremendous story. I think in a way, when you look at the mob, you can see elements of this in some of the student rebellions we saw over the last year or two. You can see it with the poll tax, where London's got this kind of consciousness where people sort of come together, and very large numbers of young people come out on the streets. It's one of the things that makes it a city which is different from some others in Britain.
And yet, London is often portrayed, or Londoners are often portrayed as rather individualistic as opposed to kind of communalistic, if you like. The London working class tends to be, it's very different from the working class of mines and steel towns and factories. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the costermonger is the classic London working class figure who's working for himself, or he's a cab driver, or he's whatever. How does that relate, do you think?
Well, I think that comes and goes, the sort of the degree of collectivity in London. You know, it's true what you say, but if you also were to talk about the docks or Fleet Street for a very long period of time, or London Transport, you know, very highly unionised, very strong collective, you know, not just now, but right back the busman strikes that we talk about in the 30s. So there's elements of that there as well. But it is also true that, of course, you don't have towns like you don't have textile towns as you do in the north of England, or mining villages in the same way. And I think that brings us back in some respects to the whole idea of the London mob. That's suddenly where all these individuals form a kind of amoebic collective which does have a political identity, which heads for, which no other town of course has, the centre of government, or the unique concentrations of wealth.
How much therefore is London the cause of all of this, or the place of it, or is it just the arena? If you see what I mean. Because obviously many of the big events that have taken place here, people have come from other places to come to London for them, haven't they? If you see what I mean.
But, well, I think there is something about London, because you've got the seat of government, because you have more inequality and more obvious inequality in the city than anywhere else in Britain. You have obviously far more rich people, but if you look at the eastern and southern boroughs in particular, you have some of the poverty that you might get in Doncaster or Hull or other northern towns. So I think it brings them together in a very sort of unique way, because people live in a city where they're so closely juxtaposed to the rich, where there's all these things going on. And if you look at some of the areas of London, you do get a sense of community historically. If you look at the areas around the river, if you look at Battersea, if you look at some parts of Newham today, you know, in West Ham, the area around the docks, and in Tower Hamlets, which we found doing the book, Tower Hamlets, time and again, is probably the place where most things happen. And,
really?
Yes, it's hugely, you know, going right back to the English Revolution. Yeah,
because it was outside the city and therefore outside the controls.
I mean, Clerkenwell was always seen as the kind of historical centre of
that's another area.
Rebellion, wasn't it?
If you look, there were obviously, again, going right back to the Middle Ages and beyond, because that was so close to the city. But Tower Hamlets, if you look going from the Levellers in the 17th century right through to Cable Street, and today with all the things that have gone on recently, if you look at Wapping and the battles there over Wapping, the election of George Galloway, always they've had elections of communists in 1945.
How much of that is down to immigrant populations historically? I mean, whether they be Irish back in the back in the days, or Jewish, or whatever it is. How big a role have immigrant populations played in this?
Massive, absolutely massive. You know, we couldn't decide in the book whether to write an entirely separate chapter about migrant London, so to say, or whether to try and weave that in. And we ended up doing both because it was so central. And of course, you know, Tower Hamlets again. You know, the Huguenots, the Spitalfields, Weavers rioted. It was an absolutely massive centre of Jewish immigration and of anarchist and left organisation. The Bangladeshi community now, it's just on and on and on, again and again for centuries.
But equally, it has to be pointed out that the East End of London in particular was a hotbed of fascism, if you like.
Yes,
it was where Mosley recruited most people from.
That's right. I mean, Mosley in the 1930s, and in the same places, in the same parts of East London in the 1970s, in campaigns that we were both involved in at times then, there was a large number of fascists in Hackney. I mean, it seems incredible to think of it now when you look how Hackney's changed, but in Hackney and Bow you had a lot of fascists there, so it's very contested. And I suppose areas where there were large numbers of immigrants coming, you are going to get a lot of contested politics there, that people say lots of people welcome them, they have their own culture, but also there's people who resent them.
What's been the role of the intellectual, in inverted commas, in all of this? Because I guess that's one of the other things that London has. It has a working class, and it has a sometimes very mobile working class, but it's also always had thinkers of the left, often from upper and middle classes, hasn't it? Kind of living in amongst and in between. And if you
it does them good. really, to be in London because the sheer weight and size of the working class prevents them from getting to Bloomsbury if they're at all looking at the working class. And I think perhaps the classic case is the Pankhurst family.
I was going to say, suffragism, the suffragette movement is essentially a very middle class movement, or even upper class movement.
Yeah, and then Sylvia Pankhurst decides, right, this ain't for me, heads off down to the East End, is very, very active, opens up her offices down the Roman Road in the East End of London, and campaigns there in a completely different way. And you can see that tension inside that family, and the route that she takes is completely different from the route that Christabel and so forth take.
Women have actually played a very major role throughout all of this, haven't they? I mean, even in my lifetime, I look at something like the Grunwick strike, which was about female employers, wasn't it? Or if we go back to the match girls and all of that sort of stuff.
I mean, we put a lot about women in, partly because, well, we're both interested in that area of history, but I've written some stuff on it before. And if you go back with the intellectuals, you have Mary Wollstonecraft, perhaps one of the greatest intellectuals among women, who was in Stoke Newington and who is remembered there now. But lots and lots of strikes. The match girls were important, and they started off the whole of the New Union movement. They were the people who began the wave of strikes which led to the modern unions we've got today. But then they kept doing this. You had equal pay strikes. You had the Dagenham women in 1968. You then had lots of equal pay strikes in London in the 1970s, going right through. So loads and loads of that, right up to the present day as well.
Coming up to the present day, and maybe even looking into the future, which is something historians don't tend to do very often, do you think that London is going to continue to have this kind of radical tradition, or is it becoming a much more bourgeois city? It's very difficult to imagine Paris now, for example, certainly inner Paris, ever becoming a revolutionary city again.
Well, they took quite a conscious decision, which this government is also doing, to move people out of the centre of Paris. And one of the contests over the next few years is going to be whether the government is allowed to get away with that, which will mean people moving not just to the edges of London, but right out of London. And one of the great things about London now is it does continue to have this radical tradition. And one of the thing, I suppose, that most people notice about London is how multicultural it is when you come from anywhere else in Europe and a lot of the rest of the world. And that is something that people have fought for over the years. They fought to get the Notting Hill Carnival. They fought to get equality. One of the products of the riots in 1981 was to get better treatment for black and Asian people in this country. And those are things I think we can't guarantee that will happen. There will be people who want to drive everybody out, apart from the army of cooks and cleaners and everybody else they expect to look after them. And that's something we have to resist.
There's some marvellous recurring things as well, though. I mean, the Match Girls factory now is the Bow Quarter. It's a residential gated community, but it is exactly the building where they're putting the missiles on top of the water tower for the Olympics. There was a big protest meeting down there recently, and that kind of stuff, we came across that again and again and again, where it recurs not in the same form but in a modified form, but in some of the same places.
But certainly what London doesn't have anymore is a kind of I take your point about the trade unions in say the Tube and all of that, but we don't have dockers anymore. We don't, or if we do, but very few. We don't have that large kind of industrialised working class.
Yeah, I think though that, if you think about how the dockers became powerful, they were casualised workers to a degree that call centre workers or supermarket workers today would be fearful of. It was literally the dock gates and the foreman saying, "You're working today, you can't. You're working today, you can't." And it was unionisation which made them into stable jobs and which made them the kind of force that we remember. Now, I think it's true the unions are a lot weaker now this side of Thatcher than they were the other side of Thatcher, but there will be moments where suddenly a completely weak, seemingly powerless group of people in a call centre or in the supermarket or wherever it might be suddenly get that moment again, I think.
It's a people's history of London, and it is a fascinating look at what's described as the world capital of revolution. I'm not sure it quite gets that.
That wasn't our decision. That was whoever wrote the blurb wrote that. But let's hope it's getting there.
But it is a fascinating look at what's always been a troublesome city, and may it continue to be so, I think. It's just approaching 11:30 here on the Robert Elms Show on BBC London. We've still got our London Weekender of the week to come.